Hey everyone, welcome to the We Are Pool Players podcast. I'm your co-host Greg Plester.
Here with Erik Hjorleifson.
And let's dive into this. So Erik, we had a pretty busy weekend this past weekend. You had a busy weekend as well. You had your own challenge match with Jason Klatt. And we had that big tournament Fedor won. We had a super Cinderella story in snooker and some other news. So why don't we start with the tournament? Fedor scooped. He continues to win. And this one was down in Florida, wasn't it?
Yeah, I can't remember what city. It was
Augusta at Rock and Grow. Okay. Georgia. It was in Georgia.
Oh, was it? Okay. Yeah, so there was about 8 players that were kind of head and shoulders above the field there, and 4 that I would say were a little stronger than the next 4 in those 8. And they kind of finished where they're supposed to as far as Fargo or what their Fargo numbers are.
Yeah.
It's probably the biggest result on U.S. soil for Jesus Atencio. He's like an up-and-coming player. I don't know if you guys remember, he beat Tyler Steyer about 100 to 85 for a good amount of money in a challenge match about 4 months ago. Yeah, so he beat Tyler about 100 to 90. It was a close match. Tyler might have got 92 or so. But that was kind of like people were starting to take notice of who this player was. You know, when you can beat a player that's been on the Mosconi Cup for a couple of years at that point. It was, and like he played well too, right? And to beat, a big breaker playing 10 ball in a long race like that, he's kind of been on people's radar as possibly one of the next young big players coming up. And he's been spending, I want to say, a little over a month in the U.S. He was down at the Michael Montgomery tournament in Texas, and he went out to Georgia this weekend and did well. Actually got to the hill in the final against Fedor.
That's right. Yeah, I saw the player list before they got started, and his name popped out because I hadn't seen his name in a bit since the match, since he played Tyler, and I called him to win it. Just in my head, I was like, I think he's going to win this, like, because he did such a performance with Tyler. And then when watching it and seeing him get to the finals, and nail biter on the finals. Well, he get bumped by Fedor to in the hot seat to the B side, and then it was DeLuna and Josh Roberts. They played, and DeLuna. So Josh settled for 4th, and then DeLuna went to 3rd. Jesus beat him. I think it was another hill, like it was a nail biter, and then they play the final. And I guess Jesus missed a 5. He was to the hill first. He missed a 5, and then that was the last time he shot. Fedor ran those out, and then he broke and ran. Took his time and broke and ran on the hill. That's the worst, eh? Like, that's the worst. Hill with a break and run. It's just the worst because you can't do anything. You could have done something before for sure, and that's the mindset you need to take. Like, it is what it is, but it's still right. Like, when it's hill, and your opponent gets up and snaps the wide open rack, and he's on the one. You're like, this is torture.
Well, I remember back in the days when the money ball counted. I flew to a tournament one time, like a 5-hour flight. And someone broke in the 9 on me, hill, in like the 7th place match or something. That's like, okay.
That's torture.
Next tournament,
Yeah. I remember winning a good chunk of Calcutta with the guy broke and made the 9 on the hill. When the 9 ball, when it was a money ball, right? And he snapped the 9 on the break, and I split the Calcutta with him. It was the best 9 ball off the break I've ever seen. When we were at the U.S. Open, I guess, this pandemic, when was it? Not last year, the year before.
Yeah.
The friend I went with, Paul Dewell, he played Fedor, so I got to watch Fedor play, and he's so smooth. His game is so quiet and compact. Like,
definitely,
he's just a quiet, simple, compact player, confident. And I mean, when he played DeLuna, everybody heard about some of the antics that happen there. If you watch any of those highlights while that stuff's going on, he's just sitting there. He's just sitting there, just waiting to play, waiting to shoot.
They said he handled it really well.
He did.
I don't think it was, it was just some small arguments about where's the cue ball on the break, and I think Luna was trying to give him a hard time and whatever. It's not anything that he wasn't supposed to handle, I guess, but with other players, it could have threw them off, and they said he just handled it like a professional and just kept playing and kept putting it to him.
Do you think? So, do you think he's the best player on the planet right now?
Still gonna go with. I haven't thought about it in a while. I'm still gonna go with Filler over him in rotation. Wu Cha-Ching's always a wild card in those conversations for me. Yeah, I think he's got to beat Shane first in a race to 100.
Yeah, agreed.
Arcolo's playing awesome.
Not to continually bring in this match room, but I mean, it'll be great to see how these players round out as each event continues. As each event goes on, how everybody kind of rounds out, right? If you get a consistent kind of winner or a top three, it'll certainly anyway. That's another podcast.
Well, a lot of those, but I'm just going to mention that a lot of those matchroom tournaments are going to be short race tournaments, right? So now I think it's a different conversation. Like, are you the best tournament player in the world, or are you the best player in the world? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I don't think necessarily the best player in the world would necessarily come out that often ahead in those short race tournaments. I'd lean towards like real big breakers in those tournaments.
Yeah,
because the difference. You're going to have to be breaking and running like 50% of your racks in those short races, right? That's the level it's going to get to, Yeah,
which
in
is
a longer race, you might be able to get away with breaking and running a little less. There's going to be, more kick-safe games. It averages out overall, but that's the one thing about pool still is that you're playing 1 hour, 1.5 hour matches where if you play a major tennis match and it goes to the distance, it's going to take over 3 hours, right? Or if you snooker matches are sometimes over 5 hours long. You're not going to see that in pool, right? So, it's a different topic, but
no, absolutely. I mean, it's funny you brought up snooker because that's another part of the recap we want to touch on for any of the snooker players out there. And I'm sure if you follow any kind of snooker, you already know, Mr. Jordan Brown wins the Welsh Open. Talk about a Cinderella story. Beats O'Sullivan in the final. Hill beats him 9-8, and had a hell of a few rounds to get there. He slammed Maguire 6-1. He played Selby before that. That is the best Cinderella story. And I mean, with snooker too, like you kind of know, but you never know. I mean. When I see snooker, I think of tennis. There's those top fives, top six. And I mean, Ronnie even said that, right? About the numpties and all this other stuff, right? He said that too in the past, not too recently, not too long ago. It's kind of like this group and then like a huge gap and then the rest of, everybody else. And there's a little bit of truth to that with snooker, but you can see the middle ground over the last few years have started to catch up, like the Kierans, like the Jack Lewinsky, some of these guys are starting to really compete. Now, they don't continually and consistently get to the winner's circle. That group still kind of claims that. But to see this Jordan Brown, a little bit of a, I don't want to say nobody, but like a little bit of a no name, he just went through the field and he had, and he won it. So that's I think it was 70,000 pounds, right?
Yeah, $175 US. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, congratulations.
$175,000 US. Yeah.
Yeah. That's fantastic. So, and it's funny because, there's something to be said about, for us pool players, there's definitely something to be said when you get a bankroll like that, like your stroke opens up just a little bit on that next tournament. Absolutely. So I'm really curious. I wouldn't say the next tournament, but like I'm really curious over the next 3 events he plays in, ranking events he plays in, how he performs. Really curious to have that sweat, if we call it, kind of off his brow, right?
Yeah, well, he went off at 251 to win the tournament, so it's got to be one of the biggest long shots to win in a long time.
Yeah,
And the
absolutely.
thing about him is, it's not like an up and coming player that's like a phenom talent. I feel like the guy's been on and off the tour for like 10 years, right? So yeah, it's rare for players to break through after that. It's usually like it either happens or it doesn't.
That's
Stuart
right.
Bingham was kind of like that too.
Yeah,
But after he won, he hung
figured it out.
around, and he has been a top player for the last 5 years. So
The other thing we should touch on, and that's thoughts and prayers go to Jeanette Lee, and that announcement that came out a few days ago. That disease is tragic for everybody, and this one's a little bit close to home as well for everybody, in the pool community. And she's done so much for the game, and continues to do so much for the game, and especially with her league presence and being that kind of icon for the league players that we just talked about this, the last podcast of about leagues and their presence, and so that's some pretty sad news, and definitely we have her in our thoughts.
yeah, well, I same with me. All best wishes and prayers. It's never over till it's over, and I'm sure she'll fight to the end, just like she's done in everything else in her life. The thing for me with Jeanette is, I feel like she was really the first North American superstar player. I mean, when she was winning, ESPN was airing a lot of pool, and she not only played the part, how do I say it? Played good enough to win the tournaments, but she kind of played the part of like a real champion. You know what I mean? Like someone that I really believe, and I don't think you could say this about too many players, but someone that maybe had never seen the game before and saw how she carried herself around the table, just like in an upbeat way, and played
Absolutely.
really well too, and said, geez, like I want to play pool. I want to do that. You know what I mean? And she's really been an icon of the game for over 30 years. She's battled other health issues too. Scoliosis for a long time, and that's kind of set her back as far as competing the last 10 years or so. But before Allison and Karen came over, she was the number one on tour in the 90s, mid 90s on. And even when they were around, she was like right in the mix and beat them sometimes too,
Yeah, she won like 15 or 17 titles just in the 90s alone, and then through the 2000s, and kind of tapered off later in the 2000s. But you nailed it right on the head when she is an icon of the game. She's a great representative of Q Sports. The way she carries herself, the way she represents the players, the sport itself. Again, thoughts and prayers go out to Jeanette Lee and her family, and hopefully she can continue the good fight.
And I think, for me, she was just someone that has had personality too. She wasn't one of these robot pool players, and you know what? I'm kind of one of them when I play. I'm not a big celebrator or anything like that, but she wasn't afraid to show a little bit of emotion when she was winning. You know what I mean? And I think that's good for the sport. I've always thought it's good for the sport. And
absolutely,
dressing the part, all that stuff, right? I think it's. I'm sure there'll be more like her, but she's definitely one of a kind.
Absolutely. So at that moment, let's take a break and let's dive into kind of the conversation for the week. Something that's a bit of a nerve for a lot of players out there, and that's handicapping. Handicap tournaments, handicapping players. It's almost like talking religion. We could talk about it forever. It's a hot button topic, and there's lots of pros. Absolutely, there's lots of pros to handicapping events, but there's lots of cons as well. I mean, the number one pro I think is player participation. I mean, if you can handicap events, you typically get more players. It's
right.
For the most part. But that said, there's also ways to handicap these events and matches as well, right? I mean, there's game spot, ball spot, staggered entry, winner break, alternate break. Like there's so many kind of variables to how we can handicap. The cons are some of the cons I think would be, it takes longer for players to develop. It's as simple as that, right? Erik, if you have two players and one player plays 200 matches even, and the other player plays 200 matches getting 2 games, at the end of 200 matches, the first player is going to play better. It's that simple.
Definitely.
So it definitely takes longer for players to develop. They expect to win these tournaments as a lower ranked, and as a lower ranked player, getting games, getting spots, getting breaks, whatever the handicap is, there's a good chunk of them that do win. And not to mention, the mental capacity of you're expecting to really do well, not compete. There's a big difference, but you're expecting to do really well because your handicap is lower. And that can affect the mental aspect of the game for sure.
Yeah, that's just flawed thinking. But
yeah. And not to mention, regulation of those. Sometimes you run into unfair handicaps, and also it can deter some pro players from even playing in the event, which, you lose a bit of the luster of the event. When you look at all those cons, and I'll put the statement out here right now, and I'll deflect it back to you and get your thoughts on this is, when we talk about, if you take in consideration all those cons, and you think about all the different ways we can handicap tournaments and matches and games and ball spot, breaks, staggered entry, I think the only handicap that should exist in any tournament, if there is one, is staggered entry. It's that simple. I think that Bob or Tina, who's a 4 or 5 handicap in a tournament where there's pros, if they want to crack at it and they want to try to push their game and they want to develop their game, well, they're not going to do it for $100. Yeah. But they're also not winning. They'll be lucky to win 2 matches or even a match. So, if it's $25 for them to get in, well, pay the $25 and learn some of the game and develop your game. It's fantastic, right? So I think that as far as handicapping go, that's my statement. I think the only handicap we should ever have is a staggered entry.
Yeah, I think other than league situations, just doing away with it all, it's should be hopefully it'll be the way things go. One of the biggest problems that it's not directly related to handicapping, but I think it's along the same discussion lines, is that lower rated players are playing for big money in the sport. I just saw a tournament in Vegas this weekend, and I'm not going to mention the player's name, and it has nothing to do with who won or whatever, but it was a 525 and under Fargo tournament, and the winner won about $3,000. Well, it's like, that's not a ton of money, but in my opinion, it's too much for amateurs. Do you know what I mean? So, I see no problem in. See, here's the thing: you'd have to have a national association or a North American association that would get together and regulate all the tournaments and split people up into tiers. And let's just go 1, 2, 3, 4, and saying that 1 is the weakest tier. So 1 would play for the least amount of money. 2 would play for the second most amount of money. 3 would play for the third most amount of money, and 4 would play for the most amount of money.
Sure.
And you just keep players in those tiers. You can always play up if you want. And like you said, stagger the handicaps where on a low level, if you wanted to keep the entries low, 4s would pay 100, 3s would pay 75, 2s would pay 50, and 1s would pay 25.
Yeah.
And the only area I've ever seen actually execute this is Quebec under a federation, and that's what they do. They have different names for the different categories than I said, but the lowest ranks play for the least amount of money. The second ranks play for the second most. Like I said, up like that, right?
Yeah,
so, it encourages players to get better, right? If you start letting ranked 2 tier players play for more money than rank 4 players, I really think that knocks the game back a lot, you know? So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's pick another sport. I mean, look at PGA. You win a PGA event, you're like an instant millionaire. You win a Webb's event, right?
you win
The
like
junior
50,000
tour.
or something.
Yeah, you win a decent amount, but you win less. Like that's a really strong point that you come up with. I mean, Fargo will probably end up being the regulator. I think everybody can see that happening in the not too distant future, and they already have. So like you just said, having the 525 tournaments and having the 700 and over tournaments and so on, they will kind of dictate that once they get more data, and they're probably going to expand that beyond just having that number. They might end up being the key to the stats. Who knows? But yeah, absolutely. That definitely deters the game. Other than having handicaps, and this was another one of the pros that I think about when we do have handicaps is transferring those league players to tournaments. Beginning the start to that feeder system of player development that we kind of touched on in one of the other podcasts. A lot of league players, if it's $150 to play in this tournament, let's say APA and CPA because it's one of the bigger ones. These league sixes, like they're not playing it. Like they're not paying $150 to play against pros. Some will, I'm sure a couple will, but like most of them aren't gonna. But if they found out that for $50 they can play against the best players in the state or in the province, well, for $50 they're going to do it. I mean, we see it, we know it, right? So I think that's another pro to handicapping is, it continues that feeder system of player development, but again, staggered entry, not games, not ball spot. I think that's a little, that's and this is coming from an amateur player myself. I don't enjoy getting games or ball spot. But staggered entry, I'll play in any tournament, yeah. Right? So, but you came up with a really, really solid point about trying to tier that money because why would they get better? Like, what's the point if they're winning? Like I won that big tournament like 4 years ago. It was like over $7,000.
I remember
as a 7.
That's too much. That's too much for amateurs.
That's crazy, right?
Too much, yeah.
With half my money, half my calcutta. Like, that's crazy.
Or maybe have one a year like that, or maybe and there's nothing wrong with it. I think there should be tournaments for all levels of players, but there has to be more open tournaments than there are lower level tournaments, right?
Yeah,
you have to push people towards trying to be their best, right? And make sure the money is higher at the top.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And not to mention it almost puts those pro events as the premium events.
Right.
Like if you want to play pool, you have to play in a pro event. Like to really compete, to get the hardware, to get the cash, to get, that's where you go. By all means, make a couple bucks, pay the bills and pay some expenses along the way. In the amateur events, but the pro events need to be the premium event. And, lots of times they are, especially down in the States, but yeah, there's some that aren't. So who regulates that? That's a very good question.
Yeah. Well, no one does. And that's the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in some areas, open events won't even fill. So what do you want the room owners to do? Well, the room owners still have to fill the rooms, and open tournaments don't necessarily fill as good as amateur tournaments. But I think this is what, the situation that has arisen over the last 15 years where people have become reliant on handicaps and people have lost sight of the end goal, which is to really just be your best and to beat the best. And yeah, it's a tricky one, but I think I don't see like Europe relying as much on handicaps.
No,
I don't see. They actually do in Asia. I know they do on the in playing Chinese 8-ball. I've heard that, and actually even on the 9-foot pool, they do handicap events over there, which I'm surprised. Not all of them, obviously, but I've heard of it.
Does this? You know what? I'm going to throw something out there. Does it not? How do I put this? I mean, to be completely transparent, it's a recreational game, and a lot of these players who play in these events, they have no plans to go pro. They have no plans to grow their game. Like, they're fine just hanging out on a Saturday, competing, seeing all their friends. And hey, don't get me wrong, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And it's definitely more about the experience than about the competition. We know there is a small handful in those, even the larger events, that, they're there to win. And not even about the money per se, but just, they're there to compete and they're there to win. But again, why? Like, what's the point of, again, Bob and Tina elevating their game? And I'm just playing devil's advocate. What's the point of them elevating their game to not get on TV? Like, you know what I mean? Like, to put it bluntly, like, who gives a shit? Like, so that's kind of the double-edged sword. I mean, does it make sense to have, tiered systems, to have staggered entry, to keep the participation level, to keep the league players transferring into competitive tour events? Absolutely. And, out of that large group, there might be one or two, players who want to go to that next level, and that next level, it's a small group for sure. And probably just a couple players. But until we get, more of this, and, I hate saying it all the time, but more of this match room exposure, more of this TV exposure. And I know everybody just says, oh, it's always about TV. It's always about TV. Well, yeah, it is. It is about TV. That's how we get the sponsors. That's how the money comes in. Like, that's how it does become a professional, tour sport, is to get the validity on TV. So until that kind of happens, it's kind of tough to have those icons that we had talked about before. Like why? Like, if I'm going to a tournament, this weekend on a Saturday, and I've got a chance to win a few thousand, and, I can compete pretty well. So who knows? But I'm just playing for that day, right? Like, I'm going to try and hone my game a little bit and try and reflect on how I did and what I did wrong. But at the end of the day, like, I'm not going pro next year, I don't think. But if there was a real opportunity to do that with a real ends to the means, well, maybe I will. Like, maybe I will do drills. Maybe I will hit the room 4 or 5 times a week. Maybe I will start, playing snooker. Who knows?
So that's part of it. Like, the pro end of the game needs to be more desirable. It needs to be somewhere where people want to get to, right? Like, I mean, and again, the World Championships are more than any amateur tournament's ever going to pay, right? Like, we all know that. The reality of what professional players are doing right now is they're flying to tournaments that are 5,000 first prize, and like, they're playing for small prize money still. Not every weekend, but they still do stuff like that, right? And the average player knows this, right? What we're looking to get to is a real tour with real money, where professional players don't have to do stuff like that anymore, right?
Yeah, or fill in the weekends with with action matches,
or
right? Like these gambling matches. I mean, they're there to pay the bills. These gambling matches should be exhibition matches. Like, it should be a big deal, right? And this isn't to go on a tangent, but it's something to definitely talk about in another one. We got messaged, and somebody brought up a really great point. Is, when a pro shows up at a room for a tournament that weekend, they should be doing exhibition matches with the local leagues, with the local league teams. Like, that should be a non-negotiable. they shouldn't have to sit there and figure out a game and find this backer and play this action and do this sweat. They should be there to elevate their brand, elevate their image, elevate the game, engage other players, right? They should have the freedom to do that, but they don't, right? Not all of them. Most of them don't, right? We're still hustling, right? Everyone's still hustling. There's like 5-6 players who don't have to hustle. So hopefully we can see, more of that growth in the matchroom environment.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your final snippet on handicaps? What's your last stance on handicaps?
Well, I think they should be, let's call it 15% of the overall tournaments. Yeah.
Do you think we'll ever get there?
I don't know. It's you have to. My solution for it is you have to pitch a tiered system that is accepted by everyone, and I think Fargo is a good start on that because now we finally have an across the board handicapping system that is close enough to working. Yeah. So you could at least you have a universal handicapping system or a system that gives everyone a number that you can put them into different categories with, and just run 4 tiers and encourage players to move up in tiers.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, that's where I stand kind of in the same. I think it has to be a little bit bigger than 15%. I think I can't put a percentage on it. I think it's more however many major league players are playing, whatever that number is, right? Once we figure out how many league players we need to get into tour events to really see player development, that's the percentage of handicap tournaments. I think I don't, who knows what that would be, right? But the staggered entry, that's it. I think that's where